Hello everyone, I'm streaming with ERIN PIZZEY, a veteran human rights activist and the founder of the first women's shelter, and the the person who has come under a great deal of feminist fire for some of her statements to suggest that maybe women are human as well, and as such can be capable of being flawed human beings. Hello ERIN, thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Oh, I've been looking forward to talking to you as well. It's been a long time coming. Dean Esme has been orchestrating this for quite a while, and I'm very glad that he did.
This is hard, yes.
Right, so would you like to just give people a quick overview of your history with activism in general?
Well, I think the most important thing is for everybody to realise I had an extraordinary childhood. We were captured by the Japanese in Shanghai in 1939. I'm 76. And we were refugees in South Africa, exchanged for Japanese hostages. So I was sort of born into war and turmoil. And then, of course, my own family, both my parents were violent. My mother was physically extremely violent to me. My father didn't hit anybody, but he terrified everybody. He was 6'4", from a very, very dysfunctional, violent family himself, as was my mother. So I'm no stranger to this subject. However, like so many other people, I thought in my lonely condition that I was probably the only child that suffered from this, and my sister and brother as well. So I got married and I came back to London after my husband was posted to Singapore in the Navy, and he retired from the Navy. And I was back in London. I had, by this time, 2 children, and I was a very happy housewife, and I considered myself extremely fortunate to be able to stay at home and make a choice of looking after the house and the hearth. Then came a moment when suddenly the erupting women's movement from America, which really sort of erupted in mid-60s, reached our shores in England. And feminist writers like Jill Tweedy and various other writers were writing in The Guardian and the left-wing newspapers about this brave new world for women. And there were things that needed changing, and I sat upright, thrilled with the whole idea. I had this vision that women could break down the barriers, particularly for those of us at home with children, where unlike the families in the Middle East where I grew up, and they were strong and extended, we were so totally isolated. And I remember the loneliness because my husband was in television by this time and away a lot, and I was virtually a single-parent family, night after night sitting, looking after the children and trying to find things to do during the day. So for me, this is what I thought it would be about. And I remember we were all told to contact an address in our local area. So I did. I was living in Hammersmith at the time, and the local group was in Chiswick. And I always remember that first meeting. Because as a side note, I want to say that after my parents came back to England, they were reposted again to Tientsin in China in 1949, I think. And that's when the communists came in and captured them. We were 11 years old, my twin sister and myself. They were captured, and they were under house arrest for 3 years. So as you can imagine, my father was virulently anti-communism, and I felt the same because I knew what was happening in communist China. And I went into this house, and all along the walls were big pictures of Chairman Mao. And I remember sitting there looking at this lady who was telling us about this very new movement, how we would raise our consciousness, how we would all sit together and call each other comrade and sister. And I remember saying to her, but I don't think my problem is communism or anything. My problem is isolation. And she looked at me and she said witheringly, your problem is that you are oppressed by your husband. And I said, well, hardly. He goes out to work and he pays the mortgage so that I can be at home. And she said, well, you're in a cage. It may be a mink-lined cage, but you're in a cage. At that point, I thought, this is not what I really believed in, went home and got together a small group of women, and we became the Goldhawk Road Women's Group. I was interested. I didn't believe that perhaps that woman was the only one like her. Maybe there's something more I could find out. Mm-hmm. So we went to the great big collectives that were called in halls. No men were allowed in. There were a few scruffy men who were allowed to work with the children in the nursery that was set up, playgroup, but it was all women. And I remember passionately standing on the stage with my group of women saying, hang on a minute, 24-hour nurseries? What normal women want to put their children in a 24-hour nursery? And we were told that marriage was a dangerous place for women and children, and that essentially the new model was going to be women and children without men. And this whole thing was rolled out in front of us. And this is going to be the new movement, and men were going to be sidetracked. And most of the women at that conference, who, like me and my friends, were married, actually left. So for a period of time, I battled on, and I finally ended up having a huge fight on my hands, because the women I was working with had been talking about the bombing of Biber. You have to remember, at that time there was turmoil in America, and the Panthers, and there was a lot of the weather people were bombing sites. And so here we had what was called the Angry Brigade. They were bombing, but this was a particular shop, Biber's. It was a gorgeous place. I went there often with my children and friends. And the idea was it was a capitalist attempt to force women to wear sexual clothes and all this kind of ideology, and they were going to bomb it. And I said, if you don't stop even talking about this, I'm going to tell the police, because I go there with my children, so do other women. And of course I did call the police in, and I did say this is what's going to happen, and nobody got back to me. So I got thrown out of the movement. I went back and said, I'm just warning you, because these were young students. I was in my 30s by this time, and I could see they'd been manipulated, and they were going to go to jail for the rest of their lives. Whereas the people who were behind the manipulation, the women who were really running this movement, were actually using them as fodder.
What exactly were they going to do that was going to land them in jail?
Bomb this particular...
Oh, sorry, they were... Oh, right, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, right, yeah, sorry.
Right, so I was sent a letter, which I still have, banning me from all collective meetings. And with that, I walked off and decided, right, this is my vision, and I am going to go and pursue it. However, they did bomb Biber's. One Saturday afternoon, there was a phone call, 500 mothers and kids standing outside on the pavement, and the poor manager of the store went down to a storeroom and opened the door, and the bomb exploded. So he was hurt. And I just sat back and thought, well, I did my best to stop that, but I couldn't.
So was anyone killed in this bombing?
No, he was badly hurt.
Right, okay.
I think he never worked again.
Right.
I mean, it did go off. It's a matter of history.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm not doubting you. I'm just not aware of it. That's... Okay.
Well, no, but an awful lot of people aren't. You have to remember, I'm 76. So the history of the early movement is dying out, because most of people are now dead, actually. So what happened? Sorry, you can ask a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems that there's an awful lot of deliberate whitewashing of feminist history, because I've heard about sort of violent terroristic activities performed by early feminists, but it's very hard to find any concrete information.
Well, yes, because one of the things that's interesting, if you look at Refuge, which is a big website, this is the woman who took over my Refuge and closed all my therapeutic programs. She's a very heavy feminist, Sandra Hawley. Mm-hmm. It says that the Refuge shelter movement was started by a feminist group. If you look at the National Federation of Women, who is the other big group that run all the refuges, you'll see the same thing. My name is eradicated. I'm not there. I'm not part of the history of the movement.
So, I mean, this is literally Orwellian rewriting of history, then?
Well, a few years ago, I still got the letter, about 3 years ago, the Refuge movement wrote me a letter to say, could I stop using the word refuge because of our ideological differences? So I didn't even bother to reply.
No, I wouldn't dignify that either.
Yeah, but that is... But to continue, because one of the things that I was beginning to learn rather late in life, being very naive. So I opened the community centre for mothers and children. We were a good group of women, and the good thing is I wanted somewhere where we could all meet and not be defined. We have a very strong English caste system. So what tended to happen is that I would meet other wives of men working in television with my husband, but I would never be able to meet and share time with women across the spectrum. And the opening of this little community centre which actually was completely run down and derelict. And it was given to me on a peppercorn rent for our group to run a community centre for mothers and children. So we could bring our kids and work and do all the things that we wanted to do rather than be isolated behind our front doors. So every woman who joined us had her own key, so she could come and go as she pleased, and men were welcome by invitation. Well, what happened is that we were running for a few months, and women were coming in from all round who had problems with social services, problems that they wouldn't go to agencies because they were frightened, but would come to us. And then the first woman, Kathy, walked in, and she came. There was 4 rooms and an outside lavatory. She came up to the top floor where we had a table and a typewriter, and she just took off her jersey. And she was blue.
So she had been violently abused?
Yeah, her husband had taken a chair and beaten her with the chair leg.
Bloody hell, okay.
And she was frightened, had nowhere to go. So I took her home that night. I couldn't leave her in that little building by herself. And there, it was like, it's an idea whose time had come. Mm-hmm. And I think this actually happens. And suddenly, overnight, women started arriving on the door. And I was getting fairly desperate because I come home at night and think, well, how am I going to feed these people? And one of the difficulties was that there was nowhere. Police weren't allowed to interfere. It was called a domestic. They could knock on the door and say the neighbours are complaining, but they couldn't do anything about the violence inside the house. But from the very moment she took off her jersey, I realised something about her. I realised that Kathy was not an innocent victim of her partner's violence. Kathy, like majority of women I ended up looking after, were actually victims of their own violent childhood, like myself. And the chances of her coming into a violent relationship or making repeated violent relationships would happen unless there was intervention, some therapeutic intervention.
Right, okay. I think that's a point worth asking a few questions on there. Okay. So, are you suggesting that she had effectively solicited a relationship where she knew there would be some kind of violent interaction?
Yes, she knew he was violent.
Right, and then that was something that attracted her to him.
And as a matter of fact, she didn't leave him until the last 2 years of her life, when she finally did leave him. And the children were so relieved. She died 2 years later.
And how long afterwards was that? I mean, was that like...
Oh, years.
Right, okay, like decades. Sort of.
Yes. I mean, you have to remember, like my mother, when she was dying, I leant over and said, why didn't you leave him? She was wealthy, she was middle class, she had a family to go to in Canada. And she never left him. And she said, I stayed for you. And I just said to her, thanks for nothing. We'd been better off in a shed. But she was just as much part of that violent relationship. Between the two of them, it was complicit. They couldn't live without each other, and they couldn't live with each other. And only her death stopped that relationship.
Yeah, I think this is something very important that is very much overlooked in the narrative that's espoused by the modern feminist movement.
Yes, but you have to remember that there is no money in admitting that women can be violent. The money is following the victim trail.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most contentious statistics that has come out recently is that, according to I think it was a U.S. government study that found that 40% of domestic violence victims were men, whereas 60% were women.
Lots of the violence, the research, the evidence-based research on domestic violence proves that the figures are about equal. And this makes sense. If you stop pitting men against women, if you stop looking at the gender war, which is actually a creation, it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Generational family violence is the roots of domestic violence. Now, I could trace my family back 3 generations, both sides. My father's side and my mother's side. Alcoholics, violence, all sorts of dysfunction. And the 2 dysfunctional people met together. And the result would have been just 3 dysfunctional children. But as it happened, we were very lucky because they lived abroad a lot of the time because he was a diplomat. So we were brought up in holiday homes where I had this wonderful mentor called Miss Williams. And she changed my life. I was an incredibly violent child. I wrote a memoir called Infernal Child about just that. But going back to what then happened, I realized at one point there was a woman that came to the door. And she had a very black eye and a little baby in her hand and a boy standing next to her. And I said, "Where have you come from?" And she said, "I've come from Plymouth, which is miles away. It's on the sea, yeah." And I said, "Come in." And then I realized that this was going to be, for me, a terrible nightmare that went on and on and on. Because at that point, the arguments was, the social services would say, "Well, we can't do anything for a woman who comes to us who says that she's being beaten. Only thing we can offer her is a bed and breakfast in her own area, where he'll find her without any problems." And the other problem is that if he says he wants her back, she can't get any welfare money, because they'll say, "Well, no, you've got a partner or a husband who wants you back." So there we were, penniless women and children, most of them arriving with their stuff in black bags and nothing else on their backs. And somehow we had to survive. Well, it got to where it was bursting. Women were sleeping with their backs against the wall, their heads on the knees, and all the mattresses on the floor. The children would lie there like little herrings, all in rows. And then we would get food from the shops, would give us food left over. And so butchers, everybody down Chiswick High Road helped. It was an amazing time. And then one day, this man came in and he said, "What do you really need?" Turns out he owned a huge construction company, because by now the news was getting out.
Yeah.
The local vicar was calling me a marriage wrecker, member of Parliament, stood up in House of Commons, and was very embarrassed by my behaviour. And it didn't matter. He bought us a huge house, which was overcrowded before we moved in.
Sorry, do you mind if I ask a question there?
Okay, yeah.
The local vicar was calling you a marriage wrecker for providing a shelter for abused women.
Yes.
That's, I mean, I guess it's a difference in time, isn't it?
Yeah, every single agency in England, family agency, everybody knew it was going on. Nobody talked about it. Nobody. And so when the press suddenly picked it up, the local press first of all, and then the national press, it began a huge argument that these are women who are basically, there's nothing wrong with them, they're provoking it, they want it, they need it, they like it. I remember a newspaper calling them battered chicken. Battered chicks, that was it. It was considered funny to begin with. But anyway, essentially, as the news got out and more women were flooding in, I recognized. So I started in 1971. And so in those early days, I realized I had two problems. I had the problems who were actually of the women themselves who were physically violent and to their children and emotionally violent. Then I had a much smaller problem, which is the women who were innocent victims of their partner's violence, who by accident, and that can happen to men or women very easily, you find yourself with a violent partner and you, for a long time, you don't quite know what's happening. They were the ones that were easy. Once they came in, they were easy because there was nothing wrong with them. They were able to mother their kids and move on and learn from what happened to them. But the women I was closest to were women who were like my mother, women who had appalling childhood histories and needed time and intervention and therapy. And so Chiswick became a very big therapeutic community. Men were very important in our refuges.
Would you like to tell me about the role of men, please?
The most important, the first time we got a little bit of money, because we all sat down and made decisions together. The only people who could make decisions were the people who were paying the rent in the house. I couldn't make decisions. I would have to ask the house. And the house sat down and we were all talking about the kind of men that the children knew in their lives. And they were all obviously violent, because even the women who were violent themselves, on the whole, the men were just as violent. But in a way, what you could see is that what we all agreed is the first bit of money we would pay a man to come and work directly with the children. And the mothers themselves said many of them didn't know good, gentle, kind men. They'd come from big, sprawling families where violence was epidemic, right the way through the family. So that was our first employee. He came to work with the children. Then men volunteered to come and work with us. So always half the staff would be male.
Right. Okay. Was there any sort of pensiveness from the women who were seeking shelter about
No.
that?
No, why would there be? I mean, they all had brothers and cousins and men, and they had sons. I mean, some of the boys coming in were 18.
Well, I'm just asking because I don't want to inject myself into this, but my sister actually she works for a rape crisis centre, and one of the things that she makes one thing that I've objected to is the fact that they don't treat men, and then they have under government ordinance had to recently start providing services for men. And I asked her, well, do you have any men working there? I mean, maybe a man might want to speak to another man about this rather than speaking to a woman about this. It's, and I can understand why they would want to. And she said no, they refuse to hire any men based on the fact that the majority of the people that they treat are women, and they assume that these women wouldn't want to be around other men.
That's a very feminist assumption, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
feminists claim they don't want to be around men, but I can promise you some very prominent feminists I know are married and they still carry on.
Well, that's the reason I wanted to ask you about it. It was very interesting that you say there was obviously they have husbands and brothers and fathers, and why would they be afraid of being around men? I mean, I think the difference is they know the individual who is abusing them isn't the same as all of the other men around them.
If you look at the definition of feminism and what they believe, any woman who calls herself a feminist will probably be thinking she's an equity feminist. She wants equality. Mm-hmm. What she doesn't need or know is the actual description, which is all women are innocent victims of men's violence. And this began, actually, the whole discussion about the new wave of the women's movement, the second wave, if you like, began in America among left-wing women. They were Marxist women, and they had actually decided to create this new women's liberation movement. And in that movement, all men, no longer would they fight with men on capitalism. That is no longer the enemy. The enemy would now become patriarchy, i.e. all men.
Yes.
That way, you have a ring-fenced movement of only women. Only women can work in refuges. Only women can actually run anything to do with refuge. And only women can take the millions and billions that are now spent on what is a huge, fraudulent feminist movement.
I think that's a very interesting... It's interesting you say they were left-wing Marxists,
Mm-hmm.
because one of I think my primary issues with feminism as an ideology, modern feminism, it's I mean, obviously anyone in opposition to feminism gets slurred as a misogynist. It's a smear that is just thankfully losing its power. But one of my problems is the collectivist nature of it, and the idea that men and women are separate classes, which I find ridiculous.
Well, men are the oppressors, and women are the proletariat oppressed by.
Exactly, they're the bourgeois men and the proletariat women, which I personally find are ridiculous.
Well, the most ridiculous statement of all is the majority of these feminists are white middle-class women who are the most privileged across the world. That's the most ridiculous part of it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is something else that so many other people have noticed. One of the issues we have at the moment are people who are sort of progressive activists, and they get colloquially called social justice warriors. And the irony of these people always fighting for the underprivileged is that they have so much privilege. They are often from wealthy backgrounds.
Yes.
They are very often people who have had all of the best starts in life, and often they have been, well, frankly, bad people. They've committed crimes. They've screwed over other people. They've maybe actually done something that's landed them with a criminal conviction, and it seems to be some kind of expunging of guilt that they take on this kind of activism with such fervour.
Well, I do say that the majority of the women who are leaders, or consider them, because the idea, of course, is there are no such thing as leaders, but there are leaders, and the point with most of them is actually they are personality disordered. I know a lot of them, and I promise you wouldn't want to know them.
Well, I mean, am I correct in saying that you knew Gloria Steinem?
Yeah, I mean, by letter, and she, when the first time I was asked to go to lecture in America, we have a film called Scream Quietly or The Neighbours Will Hear, which is the first film in the world on domestic violence. And PBS wanted to show it, and we were invited to go across to New York. And they said Gloria Steinem would front it. And I contacted Gloria and said, whatever you do, you are not going to actually politicize our film. It was made by our women, but about the refuge and the problems that we all faced. Well, that was very naive of me to think that she wouldn't do it. And then she wrote back to say, well, of course, they wouldn't be able to show the film because nobody knows who I am and nobody knows the refuge in England, so therefore she'd have to front it. And she did, and she put out a hand out after that, obviously allying it, because it became a fundraising issue. And I want to go back to 1974,
Please.
when I knew once the money started coming in and the public started sending us funds, we could never get any government funds. For a very short period of time I had some, but it was taken away because I was illegal from the very beginning, grossly overcrowded, and I had warrants out for my arrest for the overcrowding from the very beginning of the opening of the refuge. So what happened is that I knew that eventually there would be the tramping of the feminist militant boots coming my way because they were running out of funding. It was no longer fashionable. The newspapers were tired of it. So there wasn't the endless amount of funding raising, because you had to pay £3.10 to join the women's liberation movement, which is a lot of money in those days.
I can believe it, yeah.
Yeah, and anyway, that was running out, so they needed a new funding source. And of course, the tragedy for me of all this, and my vision, was that it fell into their hands because, perfect, they had a cause, women as victims of all men's violence, and they would be funded because they would start refuges, which is what they did across the Western world. From the very beginning, it was nothing to do with women and violence. It was a fundraising event, which is now, I think, Violence Against Women Act in America. I think they get $2 billion a year. And that doesn't even go to refugees. It goes directly into the pockets of the radical feminists to spend on funding their political movement, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And at the bottom level was the original statement that so frightened me, which is that marriage is a dangerous place for women. And the refuges and shelters, as they call them in America, really became bunkers for radicalizing vulnerable women.
Right.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Well, sorry. Would you like to finish that thought? Because I've got.
Well, I was just going to say that when I had been running the refuge for several years, I looked at the first 100 women that came in. We did very extensive questionnaires on them, and looking at generational family violence. And it was very simple. I could see I had the two problems, as I said. There are the women who are innocent victims of their partner's violence, and then there's the women who are as violent or more violent than the men they left. And the figure I came up with was 62 of the women coming into the refuge were as violent or more violent than the men they left, and the others were innocent victims. Now, having established that, obviously I could never even discuss it, because by this point the media, as far as the men were concerned, this was a women's issue, so you only ended up with feminist journalists who were never going to publish anything like that. And also the world of publishing. I wrote Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear, which is the first book in the world there was no literature on domestic violence, which has been out of print for years. And I had terrible trouble getting it published. But what saved me was the film, actually. It went out late at night when Edward Heath had electricity was and televisions were mostly off, but at least enough people saw it. And then overnight there was an explosion. But of course that brought with it the politicizing of the problem of domestic violence.
Right, okay. What was the initial reaction to the film like then? Was it...
Well, I remember the postman coming in with sacks and sacks of letters from women and men all over the country recounting what had happened to them. And it just, yeah.
Right, okay, and they were sharing their own experiences with intimate partner domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. And their childhoods of domestic violence. It wasn't, see, we were in 71, they did talk about violence towards children, but it was very, very minimal. It was very much in the academic circle or the medical circle. down on the street, nobody talked about anything like that. So it was, when it did explode, it exploded. And what saved me was actually, because the press wouldn't let it go, was we had sufficient donations from the public to keep going. And then we had to become the biggest squatting agency in England. In those days it was legal. And we owned houses all over England. We used to take housing that had been tarted up by the local boroughs, and they just left them empty. So we took them. And we had a big hotel in Richmond. It was the Palm Court Hotel. It had 45 private suites. And apart from the crisis refuge, that was a second stage refuge. So women could stay as long as they liked until they got rehoused. Because for many women who had been so brutalized as children, it would take 4 or 5 years before they were actually comfortable to move out and begin to make a life of their own with their children.
Understandable. Okay, so what was the feminist reaction to your newfound popularity?
Just completely, what happened in 1974, again, I was very naive. We all were, the mums and me, because we weren't political. I was religious, but not political. And we had a little, knowing that there were other refuges and desperate to get other refuges going, we actually convened a little conference, which we thought we were convening in our local church hall, where groups from across England were encouraged to come so that we could share our information with each other. Much to our horror, me and my mums, there's a very good group who were like us from Ireland, from Southern Ireland. In came these women who we were terrified of them, and they had a whole sound system with them, and they just marched in and they just took over the whole thing. They started voting all these. None of us had ever, we didn't even know what to say. We didn't even understand what was going on. But what they did, they voted themselves into the National Federation of Women's Aid and called themselves that they were the charity, which is, was completely untrue.
So they just directly co-opted it.
Yeah.
In front of everyone's faces.
Yes. And I remember Jenny, one of my mums, she was sitting on the floor and she looked at them all and she screamed at them, "The only working class women you know are the women who clean your houses," which didn't go down very well. And I shall draw a veil over what the other women said to them, because you can't say it on television. They were outraged.
I can imagine that everyone can imagine the sort of
things
they were saying.
Yeah, and many of the women were radical lesbians, and they were the ones that were most vociferous about family life. And as worms turn.
What were their positions on it then?
Well, if anybody who sleeps with your husband, you're actually sleeping with the enemy.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, these people actually think of it as some kind of gender war.
They meant it. They meant it.
Wow.
That as far as men were concerned, well, that any time a woman sleeps with a man, she's raped.
This is not an idea that's vanished either.
No, it's not.
There are modern feminists who, I mean, I was reading Feminism is for Everyone by Bell Hooks, and there is an entire chapter in there that's about feminism and lesbianism, and how she comments about lesbianism being feminism in practice or something like that. I don't think she's entirely on board with that point of view, but it's not an isolated or unusual opinion, or it doesn't seem to be anyway.
Well, I think the difficulty is where the motto always was, make the personal political. So if you're a badly damaged, angry woman who has been hurt by a father or whatever, then all men are shits. I mean, if you look at somebody like Germaine Greer, she wrote a book. It's called Daddy, I Hardly Knew You. That tells you everything.
Absolutely. One of the things I did some research, just Wikipedia in fact, you can just go and read about Gloria Steinem's background and how her father left when she was, I think, 9 or 10, and her mother effectively went insane. And Gloria Steinem, instead of blaming the issue on her mother, she decided that in fact the society that she lived in was the issue, and had it out for women in general. And is that just seems to be the most ridiculous interpretation of events, but I guess
that is making the personal political. And you see, I knew, because of my father and mother being captured by communists, I knew a lot about how it worked. So I could see it being reproduced very simply by these Marxist feminists all of us in our groups met in our own houses, and then they would send a head honcho down to tell you what you were supposed to raise your consciousness. Well, you're to raise your consciousness to realize and recognize your oppression, and your oppressor is your husband, and so on and so forth and so forth. And then along in 1972, I think it was here, suddenly there was no fault divorce. 74% of women got divorced. So think what that meant, an enormous social chaos, because of the mantra that kept going on, which is marriage is not a safe place for women. You will never be able to express or find your whole feminized self if you're living with the oppressor. And a lot of these women were young, they were very vulnerable, it was very easy, it looked terribly exciting. And what happened after that is they found themselves, yes, they did, they got the money, because what would happen is the friends of mine, male friends of mine, would end up in bed sits because the wives got the children and the house. And so he suddenly found himself ousted. And again, because in the whole custody organization, the woman automatically has custody. The man has to beg her for permission to see his own children.
But through no fault of his own either.
No.
And the thing is, one thing that annoys me about these is, I mean, like we were saying, I personally have always viewed women as human beings, and I think that any human beings, there are certain types of people who, given the right incentives, will act on those incentives because they are, well, I guess fundamentally a bit more selfish than others. And this isn't a gendered issue. This is just, there are people like this.
Yeah.
And so if you were to give men all, a series of systematic advantages in this way, you would have certain men who would take advantage of them. And I think, like, the reverse is now here true. Women who, they see that they can have the advantage of the house, the kids, state funding, and the enforcement of the man's wages being sort of garnished or whatever, and they're going to do it just because they can. Whether or not it needs to be done. And this isn't a slight on all women or anything like that, but it's just there are people like this.
And also, it was very persuasive when women were told that marriage was a dangerous place for women, and that women would be much better off if the new model being women and children, which in effect has happened. The figures now show that there are an equal amount of single-parent mothers out there. I was a single-parent mother through no fault of my own, and I can tell you it's the most lonely place that you're ever going to be as you sit at home night after night with your children. And the idea of glorifying single parenting and how boys and girls need their fathers just as much as they need their mothers. And we've now been told that this isn't true. We can have any kind of family. Men can have, in a sense, men are almost a lost cause, because if you, like I did recently, was teaching in a primary school, there's no men in primary schools. And eventually, so there was an MP whose name I always forget. And anyway, she stood up and announced that, yes, we do need more men in primary schools, but unfortunately, men can't be trusted with women, with children.
This is I think a major bone of contention for, practically any man who's concerned about these sort of social issues. I'm a father myself. I've an 8-month-old boy, and one of the things that I can never bear to hear is that men can't be trusted with children. I mean, if you look at the statistics, who is more likely to harm a child?
Women. Always. Women, far. The second most dangerous is the boyfriend. The safest place for a child is at home with his biological father. That's a fact.
I really don't know, and I don't know where to go from there, honestly. I mean, what is there else to say? I mean, if the statistics completely bear this out,
yes, they do.
How has it become so reversed in the public imagination?
Because we've had 40 years of brainwashing. When as the women moved, mostly these middle class, very well educated women, moved with their money making scheme called feminism into the media, into publishing. I had a terrible problem publishing because I wouldn't write. As one she was a lesbian editor of mine, very radical, She said, I hate you, I hate your books. Why can't you write like Faye Weldon? I said, because I'm not Faye Weldon. I believe in family life. You know, my books have horrific women characters because there are horrific women characters. They should have met my narcissistic exhibitionist of a mother. And it's extraordinary because it got to where, you know, I'd be in a shop somewhere and a woman would come up to me and she'd just say quietly, I just wanted to tell you I'm not a feminist. Because it became so contentious that to say that you weren't part of this evil sisterhood meant that you'd be very, very seriously ostracized.
That it does seem to be a manifestation of the character of a certain kind of woman.
Yes.
And one thing I think that we've seen with the internet is that there are people who can coordinate a lot more easily without using the internet, without having to actually go to places in real life, and it's having a very distinct and very measurable effect on the world at large. I mean, change.org petitions are becoming something that I find... I mean, as soon as something happens, I roll my eyes and look for the petition where 50,000 feminists have signed it saying, we don't like this video game, we'd like this video game to be banned.
Yes, that's happening, yeah.
Yes, and it strikes me that it's just the tools have become better. You know, the attitude and the motivation seem exactly the same.
Well, I think the thing is that you have to remember what drives all this is money. There is an enormous empire now built around the whole business of women controlling the media, women controlling all the things that they do control. Meanwhile, of course, claiming that they're all innocent victims because the oppressors, you know, are all in the boardroom. The fact is, even here in our country, when Tony Blair tried to put in an awful lot of women, which he did, into Parliament, most of them left because the majority of women don't actually and can't be members of Parliament if they want to have children. You can't do it, actually, unless you're very wealthy and you can have nannies. And again and again and again, there's this argument, you know, that women are paid less than men. No, they're not. Women have lifestyle choices that mean that for periods of time they won't be in the workforce. And yes, they will earn less than men. But given single women, single men, they earn the same.
That's one thing that regular viewers of my channel will know that I've covered quite often. The wage gap is the inevitable consequence of a liberal society. If you are free to make your own choices, then you will not end up with the same results. And one thing that bothers me is the power of statistics. One thing that in the modern world has made very easy with computers is to know exactly what is happening where and how to what degree. And so we know exactly how much men are earning. We know exactly how much women are earning. And instead of it being simply the natural consequence of men choosing higher paid jobs and working longer hours and more during their lifetimes, it's become as if there is some kind of, well, patriarchal conspiracy.
Yes.
In the minds of feminists. And it's weird that, I mean, even like the US Department of Labor produced a study saying, look, there may not be anything to fix here. You know, this seems genuinely to be the result of a liberal society with people making their own choices. What can be done? And yet there was still the what was it called? It was the most recent one. The Paycheck Fairness Act.
Mm-hmm.
As if that was suddenly supposed to pull back the lid on corporate America to find all of these terrible misogynist bosses who are actually paying their female staff less because they hate women. And, you know, I guess they were expecting a rash of suings of major companies where women were just, you know, it turns out I'm being paid less. No such thing happened, and nothing has changed. And it's, you know, in America it was 1963 when they had the Equal Pay Act there, and it's 73 in the UK, and it's unsurprisingly changed nothing. You know, it's very similar.
Well, I think all these issues are presented as oppression of women, and of course it's very easy for women who are busy and have children and their working day not to actually be able to follow up. They just see the headlines and, oh, this is attacking me, this is attacking me. Well, no, it's not actually, because apart from anything else, there is no, of all the research being done, the women's liberation movement behind the shelter movement for women and children have produced no evidence. They produce no research, and the majority of the actual figures that they do produce are false. There's no evidence-based research, which is why I started my website, www.whiteribbon.org, because I needed a safe place where I could put stuff up that people could go to and look and see the truth. And up there you'll see Murray Strauss, you'll see Don Dutton, who's from Canada, a research worker. Here we have Nicola Cavan-Graham and John Archer, who are fantastic research, but internationally famous. And the figures for the last at least 10 years have shown this is not a gender issue. It's never been a gender issue. It's a huge fraudulent movement to take taxpayers' money and fund a political movement called feminism.
I think that's an excellent way of phrasing it. So, can we? Sorry. Would you like? Was there something you'd like to add to that? Sorry.
I was just going to say yes, but nobody's doing anything about it.
Well, the thing that I think there's a fundamental difficulty when dealing with this, and it's it's the fact that men love women. That's the major problem with dealing with this, is that if you present a crying woman to a group of politicians and you say, this is what's happening to women, you need to do as we say to protect women, they're going to jump, whether this is true or not, whether it has any basis in reality or not. They don't care. They're just going to do exactly as they are, being instructed. And I think a lot of it is due to the fact that men are kind of biologically programmed to protect women.
And also, of course, men and their mothers.
Well, yeah.
See, one of the biggest problems, I think, and I've said this for years, I was taking in over 1,000 mothers, children a year at one point in the refuge. And I could see how enormously resilient the girls were and how terribly damaged the boys were. And they're very, I think what people forget is actually men are a lot more vulnerable. Not only do they die younger, but they die when they're babies, and they are essentially, women are survivors. And one of the problems I think that we have here is there's a tremendous fear that men have of women, particularly if they've had violent mothers. And you have to remember that the figures for women abusing children is far, far higher than for the fathers. So many of these abused men grow up and they hide the abuse from themselves. People come all the time, and women have no problem sitting down and discussing their mothers or their fathers. Men come and they can identify a problem with the father, but they find it very hard to be realistic about their mothers.
I do think there's a lot of social conditioning involved.
Yes.
in the way that we view women. I think particularly English-speaking societies, you can go back hundreds of years and you can find letters from housewives, I suppose, petitioning the king that their husbands are Charles II, I think it was. He was being petitioned by the women of England because their husbands were in taverns and spending all their time there, and they were losing their ancient privileges and things like that. So it's one of the it's one of those things that I really, I can see that maybe in somewhere like Saudi Arabia, in maybe like other areas of the world, women may well have been oppressed by an objective standard of the definition of oppression, but in the English-speaking nations, that's ridiculous. I mean, Albert Einstein went to America in 1921, and when asked by, I think it was the New York Times, what he thought of America, his comment was, American men are lapdogs to their wives. And
Freud, he said, only one time he went to America, and he wrote that American men have to deal with the problem of American women. And they didn't. It's funny, because it was actually when I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I had a refuge there. That's where I really started working with men. Because although in the refuge in London, I had a charity called Men's Aid, where we would actually get money through the shops, for charity shops, so that we could fund people to work with men directly. I also had a men's house, actually, That's the first thing I tried to open after we got the big house. But I couldn't get a penny of support from other men. This has always been a problem, you know.
Well, I think there's there's a general attitude among men that you should be able to take care of yourself. And
it's interesting. It's not even over domestic violence. Sometimes there's something deeply biological in men that if a man is perceived to be weak, other men stand back.
Yeah, I really think a lot of it is the expectation that he should pull himself up. I mean, if you were to help that man, then I mean that could I suppose that could be construed as insulting. You know, as if he hasn't got the capacity to do it himself.
You know as well as I do that men tend to identify themselves through the woman they're living with.
Absolutely.
And particularly their emotional life. They'll have a few friends, they'll go, well, not down to the pub now so much, but say they'll go to sports with. But the real centre of their lives are the woman they're with.
Yeah.
One of the problems with that is that they become so dependent on her for absolutely everything. And it is a childlike dependence, actually, in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting thing that this is something that's being kind of turned on its head now. Actually, it's very interesting because it's the rise of the single parent household and the single mother household. Really, is what we're saying. You get more and more men who are failing to start families and failing to do anything with their lives, and so what they tend to do is they get themselves a minimum wage job, and then they end up living in a shared house with a bunch of friends well into their 30s, where they drink beer and play their Xboxes and live their lives for themselves. And when a man is living his life for himself, he doesn't really accomplish much.
Well, essentially, but in a way, MGTOW, men going their own way, it's very powerful in America. It's almost epidemic in Japan. So absolutely. In a funny way, as the women of the feminist movement turned on men, and men ran away. And what's happening now, I moved between London and Los Angeles, where my son lives and his family. And what I see is desperate, between the late 30s, 40s, women who are never going to be married and are never going to have children because the men aren't there. And what their men will offer, and the only thing they'll offer, is what they call hookup. And particularly in America, where a man can see 4 or 5 women at the same time and have sex with them all.
One thing I think that I really think the feminists didn't bank on was, and I mean, this is obviously down to the paradigm of men being the oppressors and women being the oppressed. That when you're on that mode of thought, when you're on that train of thought, that justifies almost anything against the perceived oppressor. And at no point did they, I think, stop and think, okay, women, the rallying cry is, well, women don't need men. We're strong, independent fish who don't need bicycles. And at no point did they ever turn around and say, well, do men need women? Because I really think that they do. I really think that they always have.
Need each other.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, at least there was, before sort of MGTOW, there was nothing for men. These men who were being kicked out of society, effectively. They were being disowned for being men by these women who were turning around saying, well, you've always oppressed us. I mean, the terrible guilt that goes along with that for just existing as you are is, I think it's unconscionable. I think
the thing that most worries me are things like now, because they've actually widened the whole definition of domestic violence. It's so wide now that if a man raises his voice to his partner, she can pick up the phone and have him removed with no evidence other than he has shouted at her.
Yeah.
And he then, and this is what I was looking at when I was in Canada, looking at the situation there. There they call it hoovering. It's when a man comes home from work, house is empty, she's taken all sorts of stuff, and he can't find her, can't find his children. Police won't say where she is. All they'll do is say they're safe. They're in a refuge, a shelter as Canada calls it. Then the next step is she goes to get a divorce. Now, and this is true because I know it's true, there are many divorce lawyers who will say, if you want a quick divorce, claim domestic violence, because that puts you at the top of the list, you go through. And in England, you also get rehoused. And then if that isn't enough, they call it the silver bullet. You say that he's molested his children. Then that's finished. You've got yourself free and clear, and he can't ever bother you again. And that is what's happening, and it's happening all the time.
Yeah, I've got no doubt that many a man has been subjected to these injustices.
And that's why men are killing themselves at an unprecedented rate. It's the time when a man finds himself on the streets. He can't see can't see his children, can't go back into his own home. Very often can't even collect any of his own belongings, and he's left totally. There's nowhere for him to go. There are no refuges for men. There are hotlines. Hotlines don't keep you warm at night when you're freezing, sleeping in your car.
Yeah, that. Well, one thing I really get annoyed with, and I know this is going to be on a bit of a tangent, but there's always the especially in England. I don't know about other places, but the idea that you don't give money to homeless people because they'll just spend it on booze and alcohol. And I have never in my life thought, well, that's an illegitimate thing for them to do. They live on the fucking streets. They probably are there for a good, not a good reason, but a reason beyond their control. It's obviously not their first choice.
16 years ago, I came back. My lovely editor had actually remaindered my whole back, but she'd taken away my income. And so I had to get in the car. And whatever I could put in my car in Italy, it's where I was living. I came back and I was homeless in London. And I was in a homeless family hostel for 3 years. It can happen to anybody. Loads of people are only a few paychecks away from being on the streets.
This is basically what I was going to say, that it could happen to anyone. And it seems that the majority, statistically we know the majority of homeless people are men. So
yes.
I really, whenever I walk past them, I give them a couple of quid. I really do.
Yeah. A lot of them are victims of domestic violence where they end up. And an awful lot of the damage is from childhood. The streets it's full of people who have essentially abused children, males who are abused, and finally end up on the streets. And we do nothing to help. We basically point our fingers, oh, well, it's men. I think the other thing that particularly bothers me now, and it's certainly on my website, is this whole business of the Duluth model. So any man who's going to go get a divorce and is involved in the courts, the judges can say that they have to go on what they call a perpetrator's program. Mm-hmm. Even if the judge has said there's actually no evidence against you, but I still want to be Kafkas, or social services will say, we want him to do the perpetrator program. Judges actually don't know much about the program. They just think, okay, this sounds all right. So he goes along to the program, which he has to pay for. And before he can even start the program, he has to admit that he is an oppressor because he is a man.
So this is being run by feminists, then?
Yeah, the training is all done by feminists. All training on domestic violence is done by feminism. That's another very, very lucrative part of their empire. So across the Western world, the brainwashing that's gone on is because they have their hands. And it's interesting, in England, I can talk about England, what happens is that the organization called Respect, who are the ones that hand the money to the programs, will not give any money to therapeutic programs for men. They will only give money to the Duluth model, which is a model which is designed to humiliate and harm men. The Duluth model, if you look at it, it's on my website, which is the White Ribbon website.
Yeah.
You look at it, you can see there's one of the sections of the Duluth model, which he has to agree to, is he has to apologize for his white male privilege, or his male privilege, actually. Now, D-U-L-U-T-H. U-T-H. Now, the carrot and stick, the stick is he first of all has to admit he's an oppressor. And the carrot is he has to get through that program before he can see his children. So if he doesn't complete the program or drops out, then the penalty, he won't see his children. At the most, if he really puts up a fight, he might see them under supervision.
It's hard not to see this as a program of deliberate abuse.
It is, exactly. It's conceived came out of Minnesota. It was written. It was a woman and I think a man. I mean, there's plenty of men who are
absolutely self-hating,
absolute shame to their sex.
Yeah, I'm well aware of them.
Yeah, I know. And it's, well, it just says an awful lot about them. Because, you know, the time will come, and I know, not probably in my lifetime, unfortunately, but it will come, and we're going to look back at these years, and most people won't even believe this is what went on. It is so outrageous and atrocious. And the levels of suicide, I think it's 12 every day at the moment in England, of men killing themselves.
I know that it's about 6 or 7 times higher than women who kill themselves. I would have to Google the stats.
But there's no outcry.
Nobody cares.
Men have now ended up being considered expendable. And as the women had said in the very early days of the collectives, what will happen is women will go out to work, the state will become, and has become, the father. When they brought in the new Children's Act, which actually said that now it's in everything in the law is to do with the best interests of the children. What the parents didn't think about is who is going to make the decision about what's best interests of the child. Well, now it's the courts, social workers, and Kafkas, not the parents. So they've lost their parental right to make decisions over children.
Terrifyingly, it's people who simply do not care about the children. They don't know the children. They are.
But neither
they're just people. You know, they're just entries in a spreadsheet now.
How many people do you think, listening to what we're saying, would not sit back and think, "Oh, they're paranoid, conspiracy theories"? Yeah, believe me.
I'm sure there are, but I'm certain that none of this is unreflective of reality.
No, it's not. I know it's not. But you see, people don't want to think like this because it's painful.
I think the problem with thinking like this is that once you can accept that maybe you have been lied to, maybe you've been misled, and maybe men aren't the terrible, evil oppressors that feminists have painted them to be, then you yourself are, well, you need to apologise to some people, probably, and that's admitting that you have failed in your judgment is quite a difficult thing for a lot of people to do.
Well, they're going to have to unload huge amounts of training material. Social workers, I've looked at the social work manuals that they're all given to read. All men are perpetrators. It's completely against what is actually recognised by the best researchers across this world.
Yeah.
Yet they're still teaching it. They're still teaching the police. And the police know. Many of the police know full well that women are equally violent, but they know that their hands are tied. Anyone on the ground is going to be well aware of the reality of it.
Okay, so look, can we talk about the way feminists have treated you over the years? Because one thing I've heard that you've had many a threat levelled against you.
Well, I think the beginning of it all was after the 1974 when the split happened, and I remember that the night that this actually happened and they voted themselves, they all marched out triumphantly because they did hijack my vision. They did. And I sat down that night with Anne Ashby, who was the other woman worked with me, and we wrote to every single social services in England, across England, all night, actually saying to them, be careful, this is a political movement, please don't take them in as social workers because they're going to destroy the family. Well, again, very naive of us because they were already in there anyway, and we were laughing stock. And yet, at that time, I could see what would happen, and this is what's happened.
Well, absolutely, and more than half of British children are raised in single-parent homes now.
But also,
more than half.
The terrifying part of it is that social services, the women who are in there who are radical feminists, basically they make it their business to see that the woman gets rid of the man, whether he's innocent or not. And one of the threats they use, and I've worked with women who've been in this situation, where the social workers say, if you see him, because we've decided he's not good for the children, we will take your children away.
And so what's been the feminist response then? Because I really want to make sure that we've got sort of documented from you what's happened.
Very early on, anywhere I went, I was picketed and screamed at, that was just, I just had to accept that that's what was going to happen. And yes, there were phone calls in the middle of the night threatening me. And it was very hard because of sort of stupid things like if I was doing a radio show and they had to put out the time I was on, and it was because most of the radio shows were that in those days, like they are now, they're open questions for the audience who can ring in.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody could ring in because they get on and they jam the phones. So I'd sit there, the poor producer, sweating profusely, saying, "There's no cause. All the phones are jammed," you know. And I was. It was just a very difficult way to live. And I think after a long period of time of just this going on all the time, it ended up, I think, when I realized that I had been just told to be careful about post that had come to my house, and I didn't really listen. And one day my daughter rang me at the refuge and said, "There's a packet that's come, but it hasn't got a stamp on it." So I said, "Well, put it out right in the back of the garden where we had a ping pong table." So when I got home, I just rang the local police station and said, "I'm just worried about this packet." And they all arrived with these huge, cars with lights blazing and these big guys all in full gear. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at my grandchildren. I had 2 little grandchildren, and the fear on their face. And I thought, we can't go on like this. This is ridiculous. Anyway, he went right down to the end of the garden and sorted out the package. It wasn't a bomb. It was a journalist sending me something, and it just obviously slipped through the franking machine.
Right.
At that point, they just said, "Look, anything else that comes, it'll all come directly to us first, then we'll give you your post." And that's when I just had it. The fear on my grandchildren's face, that was enough to do it for me. And at that point, I was writing a book called Prone to Violence. And Prone to Violence is a therapeutic community that I created that took in all these mothers and kids and worked with generational family violence. And it was my blueprint for how this could be possible. And I knew I had a terrible time finding a publisher. And I finally did find one. By that point, I had gone to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and had started a refuge there. I came back for the publication of the book, and I was at the Savoy at that point, because there was a Woman of the Year award going on. And outside, there was this huge demonstration out on the riverside of the Savoy. And there were all these placards, "All men are rapists, all men are bastards." And I went down to the police and said to them, "Why are you doing this? If this had been Jews or black men, you'd have arrested them." And they sort of shifted uncomfortably and said, "Well, it's women." And thereafter, they said, "Well, for the rest of the tour, you have to have a police escort." Now, you don't get a police escort at the taxpayer's expense unless there's some very serious threats, and I knew that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the book didn't last long on the shelves. And it's now, you want a new copy of Prone to Violence, you have to find £1,000. You can get second-hand copies, though.
Okay.
And
but so you actually were given a police escort?
Yeah.
How long did this go on for? I mean, how long did you find yourself receiving these sort of threats and harassment?
Well, it went all the way through. And then, of course, you see, I was naive again. I thought that once I got somewhere like Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is, a very tiny little city,
yeah,
that I could then start again. And my plan was to write novels to fund my own refuge, so I wasn't dependent on funding. Sorry about the coffee.
That's okay.
And I ended up very quickly getting back into trouble again, because it's a very small city, Santa Fe, and a lot of the work I was doing was there were a lot of pedophile men and women actually living in Santa Fe, because at that point there were only 2 prosecutors, because it was a small city of 50,000 people and fairly lawless. So I was very involved with a lot of those cases. and again, the same sort of picketing, and one of the things that I remember, the first conference I was invited to, which was in Albuquerque, and I was very excited because I thought, well, I'd have a chance there as an American audience to explain what I feel about generational family violence. And what they'd done was they put my name as a headline. But when I actually got down to the university, my room that I was supposed to be speaking at was so far away that even we couldn't find it. and nobody actually turned up. I was there all by myself. So I felt very humiliated by that. But then I thought, well, this is how it is. And then while I was in Santa Fe, towards the end, there was it was Reagan who had a national team going around America, actually looking at what was happening on domestic violence. And our place of reference was San Antonio. So I drove there to give evidence to the Reagan Domestic Violence Forum. And I stood up and I explained to these people about generational family violence and where the feminists had hijacked everything. And it was interesting because the people on the platform agreed. They said, look, we are so confused because we keep seeing these women giving all this evidence. And the woman before me was sobbing and carrying on. And one of the people on the stage leant forward and said, but Mrs. X, you're talking about something that happened 15 years ago. You're now happily married. So why? And they were just terribly, and I explained the difference between violence-prone women and women who were innocent victims of their partner's violence. And I gave a lot of evidence, and they thanked me. And when the report came, there was one line under my name, and they didn't use ERIN Pizzey's name. They used my then married name. So nobody would know that I was ever there.
Yeah.
And that's a national federation movement. I mean, it was somebody had actually got in there and got rid of my transcript. It's shocking.
The thing is, I don't mean. I mean, I'm almost unsure how to not interpret all this, but what to necessarily do with this information, because it's. I mean, one thing that really I guess stands out for me is the treatment that you as a woman receive from these feminists. But
that's threatening their income.
Well, that's it, isn't it? It's not, and this fundamentally, I'm working on a piece about individualism versus collectivism, and this really highlights why this is an important paradigm for people to understand, because these women claim to be fighting for women, and yet they will quite happily deprive you of your rights. They will quite happily threaten you, even though theoretically you are part of the group they are supposed to be protecting. And it's the elevation of the group above the individual that allows this to happen.
Yes.
In fact, it doesn't just allow it to happen; it morally mandates it. You know, if any one individual within the group were to threaten the group, then that individual is a problem and must be dealt with.
Yes, but the trouble is that you see that this is how tyrannies happen, and this is in its own way it is a tyranny.
Well, that was exactly where I was going to go with that. It is in fact a tyranny, and there is no other outcome other than tyranny and the violation of individual rights. And
men don't have. See, in this country, or across the Western world, the moment a woman accuses a man of violence towards her, she immediately has to be believed. I'll give you a little example of something that's happening now. Man's going home on a train station. Next morning he finds police on his doorstep to say that he sexually assaulted somebody, and he's charged and taken down to the station. He's no idea who this person is or where it was supposed to happen. He has no idea. He's completely innocent. This matter is going to trial now. This is the result of men having no human rights any longer. She has to be believed. This is the mantra that the Crown prosecution in this country works. Women have to be believed on any issues of rape. It's a woman's word, and she has to be believed. Thereby, there's no level playing field, because the man, by definition, then is guilty. So he's left. He's now, even though they'll do the state will prosecute him, he is ipso facto guilty, and she is innocent.
This is very interesting, because the other day I had a conversation with a male feminist who we got into exactly this discussion. In New Zealand, the Labour Party attempted to actually amend their laws to enshrine that into the law of New Zealand, and I mean it was rebuffed, thank God. And this is the point I effectively kind of had him on. I was like, look, it's not that I oppose feminism because I don't like women or I don't think women should have rights or anything like that. It's that I oppose feminism because it is illiberal. You know, it is going against the individual rights of people. You know, individual people, like, and it's exactly as you say there. I said essentially the same thing. Like, if you're going to, he was like, why can't we just believe women when they say they've been raped? And I was like, because what you're saying then is that the man is guilty. You know, you're presuming that he has done what is being believed, and we don't. It's an accusation that can't be the proof. You know, that can't be the evidence, and therefore we have to automatically assume that unfortunately she's not telling the truth. That you have to assume that.
Well, because in some cases, many women who have been sexually abused as children have very serious mental health problems, and they're just as much sexually abused by women as they are by men as children.
Yeah, I think the issue for me though is more that you can't simply abandon skepticism because you feel a great deal of empathy for the victim, or because of the vulnerability of the alleged victim. You know, it's not. It's just simply not acceptable to me to just because of an emotional reaction to the person levelling the accusation to then assume that the person being accused is guilty. You know, because you can't prove a negative. You can only prove a positive. And so if you can't prove that you weren't at that person's house doing whatever was accused of you, then you will never be able to prove that you aren't guilty, even though she might not be able to prove that you are guilty. You know, the accusation is what will become the proof. And that's a terrible, terrible injustice.
Well, it's been going on, as you know, the high-profile cases here. I mean, Paul Gammaccini, there's no evidence against him. You know, just Jim Davis, no evidence against him. But what the most thing that I most resent, in another case I was involved in, where I was the only witness and the man concerned was lying. What upset me about it, when the poor, I don't even know who he was accusing, somebody in the public eye, but when that case was dropped because of my evidence, they said insufficient evidence. That doesn't clear him. That implies that this man, somehow or other, there isn't enough evidence, but something was there. And this is happening to a lot of men.
Yeah, as if he's not innocent by their...
That's right.
Yeah.
Police just go fishing.
This is my problem with almost all of this. In fact, it's not the sort of men's rights activism side of it. It's more the sort of liberal legalistic side of it I have a problem with. But yeah, and one thing that alarms me greatly is the rise of this on college campuses.
Yes, that's a really serious business. It's
terrifying. I am genuinely concerned for the intellectual future of Western civilization. I mean, the Duke Lacrosse case is one of the... It's just the most shocking thing I've ever seen, where you have... And they sound like religious fundamentalists, where a woman has accused these fellows of doing something, and you have a gaggle of feminists, a gang of them, outside, banging drums and pots and pans, saying it's time to confess. It's like, what are you, witch hunters? You know, what is this?
It's a cult, in many ways. For many of those women, it is a cult.
Absolutely. It definitely has religious dimensions. And it's a terrifying thing that they feel completely morally justified to go to the house of a bunch of guys who are just laid under an accusation and presume that these guys have done something. You know, and when it turned out that they didn't, well, you know, were there any apologies? Of course not. You know, it was...
Well, now, thank God, an awful lot of the young men are actually fighting back. Because I think even some of the university campuses in America are getting frightened because the figures for men are dropping out of going to university are really high now.
Oh, it's terrifying. In fact, recently, last week, the BBC published their reports from, I think it was... oh God, I haven't got the link now, but it was just... It demonstrated that poor white men were the lowest achievers in society now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's not surprising given all the social engineering against poor white men, because apparently
their education system had been so decimated, starting with primary schools, where in fact it's so feminized that it has very little relationship for boys. The way the education's gone, it's the idea being that the idea that you actually have these little tables where everybody sits round. Educating girls is a lot more easy because girls like to be liked and they like the teacher to like them. Little boys don't terribly care. And when you actually treat little boys like little girls, you're in trouble from the very beginning, because they're not little girls.
This is a
You've got
major
a son
problem in the
to
United
think now,
States, isn't
haven't
it?
you?
Sorry.
You have a son to think of now.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I do this.
I can
It's
believe
one of the things that I will never permit is for anyone to give him any kind of mind-altering drugs. I can't stand the American habit of drugging their young boys to make them more manageable. That is just that.
Well, because they've forgotten what boys are.
Yeah.
And that's the frightening thing, because you have to remember, in my time, my son collected action men. Now, that was absolute taboo. You were not allowed to give your boys toys. You couldn't. So when you went to visit my girlfriends, my feminist girlfriends, because there wasn't much else, because it was so fashionable, I had to go along, and Amos would bring all his boys' toys, full of little carrier bag full of guns and weapons and machetes, and there's the little boy playing with his sister's kitchen equipment and dolls, because he wasn't allowed to have even Tonka toys.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous, and the whole concept, and because everything's so feminized now, we're very quickly forgetting what it's like, what to be male is.
Yeah, as if there is some fundamental problem with young boys being energetic and rambunctious.
Well, there is, isn't there? It's being male. That's why the refuges, don't let boys in over 9, many of the refuges, or sometimes 12. The mothers have to make other arrangements for them. You taxpayers are paying for that.
I'm not even bothered about the money. I'm really not. I'm bothered about the idea that young boys will be treated just in such a way.
First of all, as soon as he gets to school, as soon as he gets to any age, he's going to be told in sex education that because he's a male, he's a potential rapist and violent.
Well, yeah, there's thankfully been a bit of a pushback against the idea of teaching men not to rape, which is, it's good to see it happening, because I'm so tired of the presumption of the guilt of all men. These men are obviously unaware that they're bound to rape unless we teach them. It's a terrible thing.
But that is the whole argument of the concept of the patriarchy, that by definition, by the fact that you have the Y chromosomes, you are bound in duty to become an abuser.
Oh, I've seen many a feminist article where they simply claim that being a man is, being deficient. I mean, these are university professors in America, so it's not like they're anyone important with any influence or anything.
I know, because I've been at conferences in America, inclusive conferences, where the people giving papers will say, I can't use my own name because my university knew I was here. I would be in trouble.
It's a terrible thing that's happening to the intellectual tradition of the West. It really is. I can hardly believe we're at this point.
Nobody can hardly believe it, but the trouble is it's true.
That's the most scary thing about it, isn't it? It's the fact that we are actually here, and we actually have to deal with it, and we have to come to terms with the fact that the establishment has become so corrupted that the establishment is the problem.
Yes, well, one of our problems is never has anybody stood up in our House of Parliament to talk about this subject. There's a new, I don't know if you've seen it, Sandy
Toksvig. Yeah, she started a feminist party, hasn't she?
Well, she called it the Women's Equality Party, and of course men are welcome. And they're going to try and get their people into Parliament, which just means we'll get a lot more feminists sitting on the benches and basically making laws against men, against fathers.
Yeah, I know. They're never... The prescriptions that they're going to enact are always... They're always going to backfire on them, because men aren't going to protest them, they're just going to abandon them.
Well, this is the thing, you see, and as we see, thanks to our education system that's totally failed young boys and young men, we have a huge illiterate section of the population which are male, and they're the ones that are going to become the rioters, particularly with the cuts coming in. I've always said the reason why we don't have so many problems like America does is because we have the welfare state, and the welfare state opiates dissenters. There's enough money to have a roof over your head, enough money to eat just, enough money to survive. That's all going now. They're going to take money away from young boys from 16 to 18. they won't be able to get money. That's when you're going to see the trouble coming.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen a major issue with the most poor people in Britain, where the Conservatives were desperately trying to cut the tax credits, and if you look at the rise of the food bank, it's and the thing is, I've been unemployed, and I know people who are unemployed, and one of the things that it's hard to quantify is that there's a culture within the job centres and within the social services where they will go out of their way to try and remove you from the benefits that you're being received. Anything they can do, any sort of, I mean, even if it's like missing a meeting or something like that, that will be used as justification. Then you have to go through a month-long rigmarole of trying to get back onto the system, and it's not by accident, you know.
No. No, when I was homeless, I had to go from the homeless family to sign on. And I remember sitting in front of this imperious little woman who said, "What can you do?" And I said, "Well, I could run refuges and write books." She said, "Well, you can pack shelves at Sainsbury's." I said, "I can." But I just looked at her and I thought, "Aren't you interested in me? And perhaps you could fit me in somewhere." No, it was just, you know, that feeling of you're a failure. And this is what we're going to do to you, because we're actually here to punish you.
Yeah, it's just the state of things at the moment.
You know what? But I just think to myself, it's lone voices now, and we're all working as hard as we can. And there's places like A Voice for Men, Paul Elam, and of course there's Dean Esme, the great Dean Esme.
Yeah.
Bless his heart. So we are all out there, and we're communicating. And this is one of the great things about the internet. That's where you get to men.
Yeah.
Because at least they're safe. They can say the things they want to say, which they wouldn't dare say as they walk down the street. I mean, you know, I just remember it was a woman actually describing something. She said, "Oh yes, and he looks awfully rapey." So now a man can look rapey.
What does that even mean? How does someone look rapey?
Oh, potential, isn't it?
Yeah. It's
a fear. Look, this is the thing that upsets me most. I have a lovely, lovely young girl. They're 3 sisters. They came to see me, and I live in the top of a house. It's perfectly safe, and I left my door open because it was hot. She comes in and she looks at me and says, "Well, you can't leave your door open." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because somebody could hurt you." I said, "Well, who would hurt me?" She said, "A man." I just said, "How can you think of men that way? How can you?"
Well, this is a society-wide issue. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to play out in the streets like everyone else. I live in, you know, a street. I know there are children who live in my street, and I know that there are, you know, that there are dozens and dozens of families around, but I never see children playing out in the street.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen anymore. It's so bizarre. I don't see kids just wandering around.
Well, because we've had an hysteria for 45 years now, where all men are basically lurking in bushes, waiting to kidnap children, waiting to beat and rape women. I mean, there's been this movement. It's been a horrific movement, and the fallout is enormous.
It's terrifying how successful they've been.
It is. It's very successful.
You know, and I really think it's just that they've played on people's goodwill, and they've in a rather sort of sociopathic way, almost, or psychopathic way, where they have said the very worst without it being valid or justified, and they have, with a straight face, said this to people who don't know any better and are prepared to take them at their word.
Absolutely right.
And it's horrible. It's the most. And they don't care about the people that they have damaged along the way, and that is just.
This
and
is
like you say,
what
it's for
most
money.
upsets me, because across all these shelters or refuges, the women going in there who have come from their own violent backgrounds, they have ignored them because they will not take women with drug problems, they won't take women who drink, they won't take women who are violent. So the women who most need the refuges can't get in, and the children, above all, the children need it, because that's our next generation. And if we don't put a stop to this movement, the damage will go through the generations. It's already been done.
Yeah. I mean, I think looking at criminal convictions in the next 20 years is going to be a very probably sad state of affairs, but it'll be interesting to see how many of these people come from single-parent homes.
And many, and also already we all know that the majority of people in prisons, the men in prisons and the women in prisons, have come from damaged children but child backgrounds. Everybody cries over baby P, wrings their hands, and then when he grows up to be a monster, they hate him.
Yeah, and one thing that always, I mean, the most, and this is just entirely anecdotal, but the most mentally healthy and well-rounded people I know come from a stable family background, just two parents.
Because they're loved. Those of us who weren't loved. I mean, my mother wasn't capable of loving anything except herself. She was a narcissus. And that is what tends to happen in very, very abusive childhoods. The child essentially learns very dangerous strategies for survival. And my job, all those years, was to teach women other strategies other than violence and rage. And that's the therapeutic work that needs to be done with victims of domestic violence, all victims of domestic violence.
Or they could become feminists and they could just teach them to hate men.
Well, yes, but if you're, that's when the concept of feminism.
Yeah, I was just joking. That's what they're doing, but that's obviously the wrong thing. But okay, well, is there anything else you'd like to cover?
I think we've covered a very, very wide canvas, don't you?
I really do, and
I hope people are listening and will perhaps contact you and continue with this discussion.
Well, I mean,
it's an ongoing discussion.
Well, is there a way that people can contact you if you'd like them to?
Well, what they can do is they can email me through the website. But
Okay.
I just have to say, as a proviso, I am flat out with the people I'm helping now. My health isn't very good, so I can't be inundated with people that need things to be done for them, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. But if for some reason they did need to contact you, that wasn't necessarily for their own help, but maybe if they could help you or anything like that with whiteribbon.org.
Yes, that's lovely.
Okay. Yeah, there'll be a link to the website in the description. There's a contact us section on it that I'm sure.
And
that
also, if they want to look at the history of the women's movement, if they buy a copy of This Way to the Revolution, it's in there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll find like an Amazon link or something so people can this way to the revolution. I'll make sure I put that in there.
Yeah.
But okay. Well, thank you very, very much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I'm absolutely certain the 1,400 people watching really appreciated it as well.
Oh, thank you.
I've got absolutely no doubt that this is going to be one of the one of the interviews that a lot of people will be interested in watching. And if it's okay if I can contact you maybe in the future if we have reason to do another interview, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I really would.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, ERIN PIZZEY. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure you will be receiving a lot of very positive feedback from your fans.
Thank you very much. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.